Every mystery has an answer. It may be that it's no longer possible to get a hold of the answer, or that modern technology just needs to catch up with unraveling the history. It may just take the right person being in the right place at the right time, but even the most famous of mysteries can be solved. Number 5. For centuries, the Bosham Head baffled researchers. At first, it looked like a strangely shaped giant boulder, but on closer inspection, the unusual shape is clearly deliberate, and the faintest traces of a human face can be seen. Who the head was supposed to depict was a mystery for more than 200 years, until finally modern technology was able to solve this famous mystery. The Bosham Head was discovered at the turn of the 19th century in a flower bed in a small village of Bosham near Chichester. It weighed 375 pounds and was twice the size of a human head. It had been heavily damaged by the elements, but was still clearly the remains of a once great statue. Despite archaeology just beginning to rise in popularity at the time, there was little interest in the head. It was moved to the garden of the Bishop of Chichester, where it was damaged even more by the elements. Eventually, historians realized that this was an artifact that needed to be protected and studied, so it was moved to a local museum, where it was cemented to the floor and promptly forgotten about. At this point, researchers had little hope of ever identifying who the head once belonged to. Even dating the statue seemed impossible, as methods like carbon dating only worked on organic material. The only way to really date stone statues is by how they're made, and centuries of erosion had made interpreting that impossible. The head was eventually moved to another museum and put in storage. Now not on display, researchers could properly study the artifact and got to work at attempting to solve the famous mystery. In 2013, Miles Russell and Harry Manley from Bournemouth University took on the project. Using a 3D laser scanner, the head was reconstructed in digital form. From there, a computer was able to aid in interpretation. Details that had survived the centuries could be highlighted, making the overall image clearer. From there, the researchers were able to trace the similarities between the remains of the facial features and the distinctive hairline to that of a Roman emperor who'd ruled the empire between 98 and 117 CE. The Roman conquest of Britain had been completed about 50 years before he came into power, and his reign was relatively peaceful in this part of the empire. The statue was believed to have been commissioned by his successor, the more famous Hadrian, and was thought to have towered over Chichester Harbor. The mystery over who was depicted in the Bosham Head is finally answered, but now researchers are curious as to what happened to the rest of the statue, and whether any of it still remains. Number 4. The story of the KAL-007 flight from the US to South Korea was once one with more missing pieces than known information. The overall conclusion to the sad story of the flight was well known. Both Russia and the US had confirmed the passenger plane had been taken down by Soviet Union fighter jets. All 269 people aboard the plane had perished, but how this had happened remained a mystery for several years. It was 1983, and the Cold War tensions were still high. The Cuban Missile Crisis may have been decades ago, but now the US president was calling the Soviet Union an evil empire, and there were talks of a space weapon being planned. The US had spy planes near Soviet airspace, including Boeing RC-135s, aircrafts that looked very similar to the 707 planes typically used by civilian airlines. It was a 707 with the destination KAL-007 that left JFK Airport on August 31st. The flight was run by Korean Airlines and was due to arrive at 6 a.m. local time the following morning. Aboard the plane were passengers from 16 different countries, mostly from South Korea and the US. Among the 62 US passengers was Representative Larry McDonald, a staunch anti-Soviet politician. The flight stopped in Alaska briefly to refuel, then set off across the Pacific. It never made it to South Korea. About 3 hours before the plane was due to land, ground control in Tokyo got a startling message saying, quote, "Rapid decompression, descending to 10,000. It sounded like the pilot was speaking through an oxygen mask. The plane wouldn't respond to messages, and it plunged into the Sea of Japan. At first, Moscow attempted to deny its actions, but later confirmed that it had instructed its men to take down the plane. It claimed the US had been using the plane for espionage. The plane had been in Soviet airspace, and the pilot had not responded to signals sent by Soviet jets. The US ramped up its anti-USSR campaigns. Moscow could prove the plane was in Soviet airspace, but it was a mystery as to how or why it had ended up there. Many claimed they knew more than they were letting on, and the fact that they would not cooperate with search efforts led some to believe that they'd taken the passengers prisoner. Other conspiracy theories, such as one that suggested the US had deliberately sent the plane to test the Soviets' radar technology, also spread. It wasn't until the fall of the USSR and the end of the Cold War that the truth emerged. The plane had not deliberately flown off course, like theorists and Russia suggested. It had been an autopilot mistake. There were two kinds of autopilot available for the plane. One was the incredibly accurate inertial navigation system. The other one, which determined the course of the plane by a magnetic compass, which can fly at very high altitudes. It's now believed that the pilots thought they were using the accurate autopilot, but instead had switched to the magnetic navigation system by mistake, which took them into Soviet airspace without anyone aboard realizing. Number 3. There are many ancient monarchs whose remains have disappeared over the years. The most famous of these is likely Cleopatra and Mark Antony, as well as the even more ancient Alexander the Great, whose grave could unlock the secrets of his death. But by medieval times, records of the remains of important people were being kept, so it was strange that the remains of one of Britain's most infamous monarchs were lost for centuries. King Richard III was King of England and Lord of Ireland for just 3 years, between 1483 and 1485. His rise to power was controversial. He was the brother of the former king, and the crown should have been passed to his nephew. But young Edward was declared illegitimate, and Richard took the crown instead. The controversy didn't end, and a dispute with another branch of the family tree led to the War of the Roses. Richard and Henry Tudor went to battle near a small town, and Richard lost his life in the fight, becoming the last British monarch to die in battle. When Henry Tudor was crowned king, what happened to the remains of his predecessor was lost to history. As the last king before the rise of a new dynasty, Richard III was cast as the villain in the famous pieces of literature about him, which were written to celebrate the Tudors. As such, there wasn't a big movement to locate the remains of the monarch. By the time there was any significant interest in finding where he'd been buried, the reformation and redevelopment of the area meant solving the infamous mystery wouldn't be easy. Many suspected the remains had been thrown into a river or reburied in an unmarked grave when the local monasteries were torn down. Even the exact locations of these old monasteries were uncertain. Eventually, campaigners convinced the local government and university to help fund a survey by ground-penetrating radar. They were able to map out the location of what had once been the Greyfriars Priory. In 2012, excavation of the area began, and archaeologists soon came across a grave. Tiles found nearby indicated the grave was barely below ground level when it had been dug. It was uneven and looked as though it had been dug in a hurry. The remains that had been placed there didn't quite fit in the hole that had been dug. The head tilted upwards as it pressed against the soil. The grave was close to touching a robber's trench, indicating it had almost been disturbed when the monastery's foundation stones had been removed. It was also just a few inches below the foundation of an outhouse, which had been built on the site centuries later. Despite the lack of even a shroud to cover the remains, researchers were optimistic this was the person they were looking for. The curved spine in particular, as well as battle scars, matched that would have been expected. Comparing mitochondrial DNA with DNA from the descendants of Richard's sister eventually confirmed this was the lost grave of the king, and the mystery had been solved. Number 2. It's a popular saying that we know more about outer space than we do about what lurks inside our oceans. That might be an exaggeration, but we do have more detailed maps of the surface of Mars than we do of the sea floor. Given some of the creatures we've discovered to be lying at the depths too far for the sun to penetrate, it's understandable why looking too deeply might not be high on many people's to-do list. There are all sorts of things that come up from the ocean, or that have been encountered when humans traveled deep underwater, that most people would find terrifying. So a mysterious loud noise to be heard across the Pacific Ocean, originating near the point where horror writer H.P. Lovecraft pegged as the home of a world-ending god, quickly captured imaginations when it was picked up by equipment owned by the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. The noise, which has been nicknamed the bloop, was recorded in 1997 and was heard by underwater microphones positioned more than 5,000 kilometers apart. According to NOAA, it was unlike anything they'd ever heard before. It sounded organic, but the bloop was much louder and much deeper than anything any known animal could produce. An animal would have to be much bigger than a blue whale in order to produce the sound. The mystery meant imaginations ran wild, with theories of some unknown sea creature hiding in the most remote parts of the Pacific Ocean. It was only recently that the giant squid was recorded alive for the first time, and 150 years after its existence was confirmed by marks left on whales. So it didn't seem impossible that some mysterious creature was responsible for the noise. There were a few problems with this theory though. It didn't seem possible for something that big to have gone unnoticed for so long, and why was this the only evidence that it existed? Scientists had a different theory: ice quakes. Further research recorded more similar noises to the bloop. Each one they could prove was caused by giant sheets of ice breaking away from Antarctica. The discovery finally solved the famous mystery. If there's anything bigger than a blue whale hiding in the ocean, it's yet to make itself known to us on the surface. Number 1. It was a series of flukes which solved the mystery of what happened to a 70-year-old grandmother who was missing for almost 30 years. Griffin Lake in British Columbia is an idyllic location with a beautiful view of the mountains and forest. The Trans-Canada Highway runs beside the north and east edge of the lake, which a series of cabins sits on its north bank. In 2019, a family came to visit the lake, staying in the cabins. They'd heard about a news story from 10 years earlier. A van had driven into the lake in June of 2009 with a family of 4 inside. The family were rescued by 2 teenagers who received a bravery award. The guests were curious as to whether the van itself was still in the lake. The cabin owner's teenage son took the guests onto the lake, and they found an overturned vehicle not far from the road. They assumed it was the van from the 2009 incident, so they didn't report it. A few days later, they were discussing it at a picnic and were overheard by an off-duty police officer. The officer knew the van had in fact been recovered and the second vehicle needed to be investigated. The teenage son went back out to the vehicle with a GoPro to help identify the car. The license plate showed that it belonged to a woman who'd been missing since 1992. Janet Ferris had been en route to her niece's wedding when she vanished in October of that year. She was last seen on October 2nd. She'd stayed at her sister's house and stopped to buy gas at Salmon Arm, about an hour's drive from the lake. When she didn't show up for the wedding, Janet's family and local police searched the area. Ditches along the side of the highway were searched by foot and helicopters were brought in for an aerial view. It was thought that she must have driven into one of the deeper lakes in the area, but there were no signs of any issues on the road. There was a fear something darker may have happened, but with the car and Janet missing, the truth remained a mystery. When the rescue workers pulled the car out of the lake in 2019, remains were found inside. They were later confirmed to be that of Janet. It brought the mystery to a sad conclusion, but Janet's family were happy to finally have answers. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you like this video, be sure to click that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knots, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.